There are many different ways to be an activist. And sometimes it's the courage to stand in public, to go to a demonstration, to be in those spaces. Dissent can take enormously vast types of forms, right? It can be quiet dissent. The history of the civil rights movement and the history of queer people throughout history has always been quiet dissent. It is saying that your safety, you being here, that is a form of dissent. And if you're a queer person and you're engaging and thriving at whatever level it is that you can do, that is a form of a dissent from a system that fundamentally does not want you to succeed.
Hello, and welcome to Power Beyond Pride, a weekly queer change-making podcast bringing you voices and ideas from across our fierce and fabulous spectrum to transform our world. I'm Kenyon Farrow, writer, activist, butch queen, and I'm very happy to be here with my co-hosts.
And I'm Mattie Bynum. Like I always say, I'm the loudest person in the room, whether I'm laughing, telling a joke, or just because I have on a loud color. That's just me.
I'm Shane Lukas, and I'm a harm reductionist, a lifelong harm reductionist, owner of a great idea, and I'm I'm a unicorn wrangler. I love nothing more, because it's Pride season here in North Carolina, and I love nothing more than finding a bunch of unicorns and being like, yeah, let's bring all the power. So.
And I'm Melodie KG, a Minneapolis-based speaker, writer, artivist, overall provocateur. Once a month, some of us at Power Beyond Pride gather in what we call the Reply All, where we focus on issues or questions impacting activists, share insights from our own work across our communities, and take questions from the Power Beyond Pride mailbox.
And we do love your questions, so we do encourage you to send in your questions. But let's get started. So the Friday, U.S. District Judge William Smith blocked the Trump administration from disfavoring art groups seen as promoting gender ideology when awarding National Endowment for the Arts grants, ruling that the policy violated the First Amendment. And in his order, the judge concluded that the NEA final notice imposes an unconstitutional viewpoint-based restriction by penalizing artists and organizations for promoting gender ideology, stating that the NEA intends to favor applications that promote gender ideology precisely because they promote gender ideology. I'm gonna have to work through that. So essentially, the ACLU praised the ruling and said it protects artists working with transgender and LGBTQ plus themes from self-censorship and project alterations, celebrating a victory for free speech. And this was really a big week for free speech. So I bring that up because that happened this past Friday. But then we also had the Kimmel experience over the last week, which we're all familiar with, where Kimmel's late night show was pulled off the air very quickly after some comments made about the assassination of Charlie Kirk. And many of us across communities responded by saying, hey, we could talk about whether the comments were appropriate or not. But this silencing based on the presidential sentiment or some kind of rubric that comes from political cycles, that may not be good. That's not cool, right? And so a lot of us responded many of us across communities, by canceling our Hulus and Disneys and then being sad because I like Alien Earth and different ways that we demonstrated and responded to that. So I guess right on the table right here out front is the First Amendment feels like we are seeing so many attacks, right? So how are you all feeling about that? Do you feel like the courts are doing their job at this point? Or do you feel like we need to be doing more because they're testing a lot of water?
Well, I feel like to a large extent, the courts, a lot of the kind of district courts are doing their job. The question is what happens at the Supreme Court, which we know has, in the last few years, pretty much handed Trump everything he asked for. Any cases that came before them that dealt with the issues that the Trump administration and kind of the sort of MAGA right brought up into court cases. So I think it remains to be seen whether at what point the Supreme Court will issue any smackdowns, but they have not so far, right? So I think we're lucky to some extent that we've had the district courts doing some level of protective work, and they haven't in all cases, right? There's certainly been cases that were shopped around to conservative courts, some of them Trump appointees, in order to get favorable decisions before going to a Supreme Court. So I think happy at this point, right? Then we have the courts sort of that have stopped some of this, but I don't think we're out of the woods just yet.
No, and I honestly will say too, being an actress and a comedian, I really felt with Kimmel because if we can't have free speech now, and granted, what he said may not have been the nicest thing and may not have been the sweetest thing, but who goes to comedy shows to hear something sweet and nice? Who watches late night TV to see something sweet and nice? So I felt like in this situation, and then also with this article, that if the First Amendment is under attack, if free speech is under attack, then at this point we already gone to hell in a handbasket. Because it's like, where else do we go from here? If I can't openly say a joke or say how I feel or defend my stance and how I feel, but Charlie Kirk can, what world are we living in? That's crazy to me. Now, I say this with a loaded mouth, I guess, in a way. I don't knock what he said because everybody does have freedom of speech. I get it. I don't have to agree with it. I don't have to approve of it, but we all have it. So my thing is, because I was talking to some friends this week and they were like, well, it wasn't right. And I'm like, no, it's not right. But if we tell him he can't talk, then that's what they're doing to us, telling us that we can't talk. So I don't condone it, but I also don't want to see a United States where we can't all have our own opinion freely.
I want to give some sex worker rights perspective here because for sex workers, free speech has had a very turbulent decade. And certainly we've sort of seen the writing on the wall as sex workers in terms of rollbacks to all kinds of civil liberties and human rights, but free speech definitely, especially since the passing of Fox de Sesta in Trump's first go round. So, and that particularly pertains to free speech on the internet, right? So, I mean, we can see simultaneously media censorship in mainstream TV shows and in movies and all those kinds of things, simultaneous with online spaces being continually more aggressively censored, especially around sexuality, sex education, even bleeding into some repro rights stuff, right? So, and sex workers who used to thrive on the internet have since lost a lot of digital space due to the conflation of sex work with trafficking and thus the forced removal of a lot of what should have been protected First Amendment platforms being essentially taken away, right? And I also want to say here that even in non-online spaces, free speech and other civil liberties, even though our Constitution says that all people have an equal right and access to these things, they've never been equally applied to all individuals. It's always preferential treatment for who's considered a person first and foremost, which now like trans people and immigrants to the United States for whatever reason are not being considered people. Sex workers almost never considered people, right? So that liberty of the First Amendment is not equally applied between all of us. We saw this through like the civil rights movement, right? Where people were actively suppressed for voicing their, even though it was protected under the First Amendment. So I don't think we can ever really, and this is always going to be my vibe, right? Like the government really doesn't want everyone to thrive. It's really a select group of people, and that's how it's always been. So I think, especially where we see district courts doing a really great job, that's great to see. And the Supreme Court sucks. And I don't know, man, it looks bad. It looks real bad.
So it's funny you talk about it from that. And that, I mean, it is bad, right? It is bad. Well, so one thing that you bring up, Melodie, I think is really interesting. And again, I think it's kind of inherent in the conversation is this idea of freedom. And I think that word has obviously been, I think it's been through different variations of application throughout the nation. And freedom means a lot of different things to a lot of people. Americans boast about their levels of freedom, but on a global index, we aren't necessarily, I would say, the icons of freedom that many Americans think they are. But I think what's interesting to me about this conversation is that on one level, Mattie, I would actually say like the comments Kimmel made were not the most egregious or harmful comments I've certainly heard even coming out of the Oval Office about many things around the destruction of other people, around violences, around cruelties. Like the insensitivities that we have become accustomed to on a given daily basis, again, it's suspect as to why these comments specifically brought this level of ire. It's really trying to redefine what they think the line is. But that's, I think, the point, because they talk about it a lot and I say we're talking about conservative movements. We're talking about movements that are looking to limit speech, children's books with gay characters in them. These are censorship practices that have been in effect for a long time. But it's always been under this guise of freedom, which is, I think, interesting. And I don't know, and I'm curious what your thoughts are, how we get it back as a term, because in some ways we are the ones actually advocating for freedom. We want, and I support, I don't agree with, individuals of extreme right-wing agendas to be in spaces, people like Charlie Kirk, people who, are caustic, cause enormous amounts of harm and cruelty, do it in very nefarious ways. Like, I am not thrilled about someone like that having access to airways, but I believe in the principle that every individual, as Melodie said, that we have a contracted agreement that every individual who agrees to this citizenry engages in a space and encouraging spaces where people have the freedom of speech, as long as, again, the fire rule would be don't yell fire in a crowded theater to cause harm, that kind of thing, which we could argue is certainly the executive office currently seems to not also recognize, because thing. Like the amount of harm that is caused unnecessarily by essentially, and I would argue that something like the whole comment, the unproven, unscientific comment of claiming something like Tylenol causes harm, which to be clear, it does not. It is a myth. There's no scientific proof for, but that is like yelling fire in a building, because you have a lot of people in very vulnerable states thinking about the well-being of their pregnancies, and they are trying to get these messages from varying sources. And theoretically, someone is in an officious role just yelled fire for people who may be dealing with pain, maybe looking at other ways that they have to deal with their day-to-day concerns regarding their pregnancies. And so I'm concerned because they're doing this under the banner of freedom of speech. They're saying they're advocating for freedom, and it is the exact opposite of that. And I don't know, as a movement, how do we say, but that's not freedom of speech? That's clearly not freedom of speech. That is the antithesis.
I'm going to be honest. Well, first of all, let's address the fact you said there's a conspiracy. There is no conspiracy. The reason why Jimmy was taken off was because he talked against the regime that considers themselves our president and our administration. That's why he got taken off. So there's no conspiracy. That's the truth. But then also, if you notice, the truth is what's considered now to be discounted speech. And I like to say that because there's no freedom in what you say. But if you go out here and tell, it started first when they started not fact checking Facebook and all of our platforms. And then they had a debate where clearly nobody fact checked the man while he was doing a presidential debate. He's
eating cats and dogs.
Cats. Right, exactly. So now that he's in the office, I'm not surprised he's telling people that Tylenol causes autism, because I think he got a touch of autism himself. So he might not understand what the truth is and what freedom of speech is. Because it's interesting to me how we talk about it and we say that Charlie Kirk, first off, and I don't want to throw anybody under, but I don't want to say anything disrespectful, but I was watching CNN and they were talking about how we have to honor his legacy. Well, first off, let's just be honest. I honor his life because nobody deserves to be killed. Nobody deserves to be killed. I do agree with that. But to honor a legacy that spews hatred and division and causes, I don't care if you do try to make it nice and say, I just want to start a conversation. You are starting a fire. Like you said, you're yelling fire in a crowded building. So no, I can't support honoring that. And I can't support sitting here and listening to gibberish and lies and my version of a definition, when in reality, Trump, let's be honest, you never went to school or learned how to even spell. So how? And then we got RFK sitting there talking about you don't need a hepatitis B shot or a measles, mumps, and is it rubella? I always say that wrong. Is it rubella? Okay. The whole country right now, to me, it reminds me of a movie that I can't think of it, where everything wrong was right and everything right was wrong. That's what I feel like.
Idiocracy?
Right
Idiocracy a little bit. Yeah, it's that.
Yeah, I think that part of the issue is that the concept, well, first of all, everything frankly, in the Constitution did only originally apply to white Christian men who were land owning. And then
Can you
I would
say that one
extend
more
that,
time for the people in the back?
yeah, to white Christian men who were landowners, right? And probably slave in the same token. So that's who the protections were originally drawn for. Everybody else had to fight their way into the Constitution for protections. And so I think we're still living in the reverberation of that, so that free speech means the freedom of cis, heterosexual, white Christian men, particularly if they have money, to be able to say whatever they want to say, while the rest of us can be subject to a whole range of attack and whatever. And so it's part of why the kind of, if you just think of even a year ago, they were pushing this idea that like cancel culture had gone too far, right? Which is to say, because of social media and the kind of democratization of media, which means that you have more people, diverse people having access to platforms, meaning that you just can't say what the fuck you want to say and not have a response from people that you don't want to hear from, right? And so that's the issue, right? It's not like most of us have the power to take any of these people off the platforms, but they did not like the fact that like they had to deal with the kind of mass critique of things that they said or did. And so this is, what this is about. So a lot of to me, the frame around freedom, they have as you kind of, I think are suggesting, Shane, kind of made, when people say freedom, the sort of imagery that is in people's heads is about a certain kind of like idea of white settler manifest destiny, freedom to go and do and exploit and rape and pillage and say whatever shit you want about other people. That's the frame that's in their head, right? And the rest of us are expendable, right? As long as they have that access. Because this also is I mean, use a quick example. I'm thinking about the Marlon Riggs' film, Tongues Untied. So for listeners, Marlon Riggs is a Black gay filmmaker. One of his documentaries, Tongues Untied, which premiered in the late 1980s, became the subject of it was one of the things that Senator Jesse Helms from North Carolina used as an argument to defund the Corporation for Public Broadcasting in the late 1980s. And here we are, not even 40 years later, with the defunding of Corporation for Public Broadcasting. Why? Because supposedly they promote too much Black, LGBT, Latino, immigrant, whatever, Muslim, like whatever their kind of like boogeymen are, but they've carried it that far. And part of the reason why they've also gotten this far is that the Democratic Party has failed to put up a challenge, and they have continually, since the Bill Clinton era, just sort of moved the needle further to the right and allowed the right to gain more traction on the issues. And so therefore, we don't have an operable opposition party to actually defend people, right? To defend the rest of us. And so that's where we are with speech in this country to me.
Well, and we're going to continue this. We're going to take a short break right now. Thank you. I mean, there's so much to dig into this. And I think and when we come back from break, we're actually going to continue and carry through some of this conversation. I think some other additional headlines and some other parts of this conversation. So we'll come back with a deeper dive in just the other side of the break. So please stay tuned. This is Power Beyond Pride with an amazing group of people here. I'm so glad to be with you all and having this conversation. I'm so glad for our listeners here as well. So we'll see you right after the break.
Welcome back to Power Beyond Pride. We are sitting here having a discussion about freedom of speech, the First Amendment, and where our country is taking a turn to basically isn't really free anymore. So let's dive back in. I don't know, Shane, you had a point that you wanted to make about it?
Well, yeah, I loved Melodie's statement earlier around like, we've never really had freedom. I think it's a promise. I think it's a promise that has always been there. And I think it's an aspirational one that many of us who work in movement work aspire to. We're never really quite there. I was really fascinated this last few weeks, obviously after the assassination of Charlie Kirk. A lot of the conversations came around and kind of fueled by transphobic language, fueled by a lot of other things that were going on in communities around how to respond to trans community members having access to weaponry. And I was really sort of taken aback a little bit. And I'm curious what everybody here thought of the NRA, if you will, sticking to their guns, if I can use that term. And I am not, just to be clear, I'm not a big proponent of the level of universal access that the NRA certainly is. But what I actually found interesting was the consistency with which they demonstrated their support for all individuals, regardless of gender identity and expression, to access guns, which is for them, again, a Second Amendment right. And so I think I was really surprised by that and taken back a little bit because there's so much hypocrisy across conservative movements. And we certainly, like we talked about before break, they talk about freedom, but they're actually, in many cases, advocating censorship. They're advocating the reduction of freedoms of speech for other individuals. And yet in our own movement, I'm curious how you all responded to that NRA announcement and how that kind of made you feel a little bit. Like, I was like, way to go. In terms of not being transphobic in your application of your own principles. Yes, maybe. And then also how we as progressive movement participants and organizers really look at sometimes the challenges to consistency that we face on a grassroots level. If we are dealing with community members who may be hostile to inclusive practices, if we are working in housing and other systems where our commitment is to serve community members, and you have community members who may not support the presence of you and other individuals, your identity, your story, and yet your commitment to that mission and that work has to hold. So I'm curious what people think about, first of all, that NRA ruling or that NRA statement.
I know for me, I have 3 guns. So I automatically applaud and approve of the ruling. Yes, because I love my weaponry, but I was also raised in the country around law enforcement. So I also know how to properly handle weaponry, because that is a big thing that I always tell people too. It's one thing to have a gun, and it's another thing to properly know how to use, store, and clean a gun. Everybody don't.
It also
need
sounds like a
gun
pickup
that has
line,
a gun.
Mattie, if I can say. Just add that as a pickup line. I think that would actually work really well.
Put that on my Hinge profile. I have 3 guns. Now,
Now I just know how to properly handle weaponry. I think just kind of that's a.
Shut up, Shane. We're not even get it.
Not
back
Shane
to the
being thirsty.
topic.
I'm being shamed here. I'm being shamed.
Properly handle
Okay,
weaponry. Yes. And that brings up a whole other topic that we'll discuss off mic that I saw the other day. But I will say that I do appreciate the NRA for 2 things. One, out of all the years the NRA has been established, they have never changed their position. They have not. They have stuck to their guns. They have stand 10 toes down. They have really solidified who they were. And I'm going to be honest with you. Like right now, I don't feel the same for the LGBT community. I don't feel the same for organizations that say they help the LGBT community. Because I feel like if we want to get to a place where we are able to stand strong like the NRA, first off, we have to bring the L, the G, the B, and the T, and the Q all back together. Because in our community alone, we're not connected. We're not united. We're not standing strong. So how do we expect other people to treat us? Like I remember giving my niece an analogy. I told her, I said, you and your sister may not always get along, but when you're in public, y'all are a united front. I don't care who it is. Y'all might cuss, scream, yell, hit, fight at home, but when you get in public, nobody can get between the two of y'all. And the sad part about it is, in our community, I don't even see that. Like I see us in public fighting against each other. I hear different derogatory comments, so to get to being where we can be consistent with our movement, to have a purity and an honest, true point that our movement and message has, we first got to come back together. That's the first conversation it has to happen.
Well, and I think too, like, there's a point here around, and I don't know how much it'll stand. We'll see where the sentence is at the end of my talking. But I feel like there's a through line here between like rhetorical consistency and the effectiveness of movements. And I think that's what you were alluding to earlier, Kenyon, which is there is a tendency, especially within progressive movements, which I love about us, which is the ability like to publicly change our mind about certain things, right? As new evidence comes about, we sort of change and reevaluate our practices. As things happen, we say, oh, wait, trans people are actually like part of the equation. But on the other side, we tend to see I'm sort of naming here as like rhetorical consistency. Freedom as a term it's not adhering to a definition of freedom that we've all agreed to. It's a rhetorical piece of movement building that has resonated a certain way with a certain group of people. And that vision of what freedom is remains consistent, right? Whereas throughout the years, progressivism has sort of said, oh, well, maybe what our freedom looks like is liberation for trans people. Maybe what our liberation is socialism. Maybe what our liberation looks like is anti-capitalist, right? And so we have these nuances. And I think one of my colleagues says this a lot, which I think applies here as well. And I'm using reductionist terms here as like Democrat and Republican, right? But like Republicans will give you a brownie. Democrats will give you a recipe to make a brownie. But people want brownies. They don't want a recipe. They want a brownie. They want the rhetoric because it's easy, because it tells people what a thing is, what's right, what's wrong, right? And the recipe, there's too much room for confusion. People don't want to cook. Nobody wants to deal with an oven, right? Nobody wants to cook a brownie. They just want to have a brownie. So it's easier to cling on to these notions of freedom or guns rights or whatever the thing is when it has like a rhetorical consistency and frankly, like a bunch of money behind it. Project 2025 as an example, right? There's a hype around a thing that speaks to a core that people are really interested in. And I think what progressives have not done a great job of is finding and expressing a core that can be extrapolated across new developments within our movements.
Yeah, I think too, the thing about the NRA, I will also say, and like, I'm a little more cynical about their move to this. To me, this is also, so yes, they've been consistent in the sort of policy around the Second Amendment, which means anybody anywhere should have whatever kind of gun and weaponry they want to have, which has basically been their policy and political stand. Now, we also know that I'm also not going to take this recent statement and not think about, they have actually were pretty substantially decimated over the last 5 years by successful litigation, like in New York State and in some other places, that really just challenged their infrastructure, right? And so it's not surprising to me now, right, that they're not abandoning their core kind of political, but they are actually expanding who they're talking to, right? To me, which is craven kind of ploy around needing members. To me, that's the part of how I see that. So are they correct in the rhetoric of it? Sure, right? Like trans people should be able to own guns, whatever, right? And practice self-defense or use them for whatever, hunting and everything else that they talk about. That's all fine. And there's no debate about that. The question for me is the why they did it now. And again, looking at what happened to the NRA in the last few years would suggest to me that they also are trying to find their way. And so maybe are more interested in kind of incorporating different voices, or at least highlighting different kind of constituents that they haven't tried to speak to before as a way of saving the institution.
No, and before we go to break, I'd just like to get your thoughts on one more side of this, which is, again, I think, Melodie, your point about the brownies, first of all, not only made me hungry, it made me really want to. Right. But I think to your point, in that really, I want a brownie. I don't want a recipe for a brownie. And I think, Kenyon, to your point around the manipulation of the language, like sometimes what I would say is that they're maybe rhetorically consistent, Melodie, but they're not practically consistent. And I think that's the part where I don't know on the left, how do we approach this idea about, and we'll go to thoughts and prayers. We'll just go with that, as thoughts and prayers is a great example of that to be so interested and invested in the preservation of life and the preservation of young people and their well-being, and yet a right wing that fails to consider the well-being of young children at so many levels, right? At accessing early education, at accessing school lunches, at accessing safety from artillery, that at the same time, they espouse this sort of life focus and they use that rhetoric all the time. And yet there's so many holes in it that it is a Swiss cheese of a rhetoric. And so I struggle because I don't know, on the left, I feel like there is this accountability that if we do say something, then there are so many people in our communities who may bring a lived experience or point out, or at least be thoughtfully, or heaven forbid, have some intellectual prowess to really think through the critical thought necessary to say, you say you care about children, but yet you are defunding, right, all of the childhood things like access to food and housing. How do we do? Is there, just I know we have to do this real quick before break, but is there one thing that sticks out around how we do that? I mean, not necessarily the hypocrisy, but like, how do we make a brownie that actually is that aspirational, where people go, yeah, that's what I want. I want that.
I think it's maybe, and maybe this will be controversial. Again, we'll see what happens at the end of the sentence. Maybe it's more propaganda, right? Like, we need our own, we need our own. I mean, we saw it with #MeToo, for example, right? Like, and this was sort of bipartisan, but it was still largely like labeled a progressive movement, right? Me Too was, where we had a moment in time where we were able to capture a large audience by, again, tapping into our communities, using lived experience, and creating a hashtag, right? That got really popular and now is like in the lexicon, just like this notion of freedom is, just like thoughts and prayers, right? So there's a rhetorical piece that's sometimes missing within this. And whatever, release the Epstein files, right? Like, we need a rallying cry that feels more like a brownie that people can come together around behind. You know what I mean? So,
Eat.
and we just
probably
don't really have that.
a pot brownie, even.
It's going to be a pot brownie. Yes, sir. It's going to have some walnut.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of the edibles, but so I think Melodie's right. I think it's partly the sort of rhetoric and frame, like the narrative. Somebody does communication strategy. It is partly that, but it's also partly, so even when we have those things that are successful, the disconnect is we don't have the instruments of power to actually implement as well as the right does, right? So for instance, when I think about the left, and I'm thinking about the span of the left, right? From liberals to more radical left, right? But just within that, the things that kind of give us infrastructure to do the work that we do is philanthropy and then ultimately a reliance on the Democratic Party to actually pass the things that we actually demand, right? And in both cases, we come up short, right? So in this year, there's been a lot of discussion in like kind of media circles around how much the right wing just has given money to all of these different influencers, right? They're just literally writing hundreds of millions of dollars of checks to keep these people on YouTube and on TikTok to just do whatever, right? And if you apply for a grant from a quote unquote progressive funder, you are filling out 25 pages of paperwork for $10,000 fucking dollars, right? And they want to control what you do with it, right? What you get to say and what you don't get to say. Right. So from the space of actually building grassroots movement and actually creating not only the rhetoric, but also the political demands, those things are controlled by rich people who run liberal to progressive foundations. Then when it gets the policymaking piece, where we're making demands of actually the people who sit in city, county, state, and federal governments to actually pass bills that people want, they actually don't do it, right? Like even among things that are very popular, because they also are controlled by donors, right? So it's why as popular as a $15, I think we ought to be talking about 2025 at this point, We were talking about $15 minimum wage 10 years ago. Now the price is up. We need to be talking about $25 an hour. But we don't have a Democratic Party that is willing to fight for that tooth and nail for 40 years, 50, 60, 70 years away. A lot of the things that we're living through in the last, 9 months were wet dreams of Republicans in 1968, right? And they never veered from it, right? And they have done everything to make sure that we got to this very moment now. And so I say that to say that's also part of, so it is partly the rhetoric piece, but when I look at like how we build actual movement and then also how we then build the kind of policy and legislative regulatory state to support those values, we don't actually have friends on our side, if I'm being very honest.
Well, to your point, like even the Democrats that we do have, because of our political system, which is driven by capitalism, like they're still subject to doxing, to harassment, to bullying and losing their jobs, right? Because at the end of the day, like we've seen West Wing, we know what happens when you got to make a deal, right? In politics, that's what happens. Like people make trade-offs because it won't fully upset the other party, and therefore, like
party, right? Those parties. So they also get what's the word I get? There's punitive actions taken by their own parties, right? AOC
by their own parties,
and we've seen the way she's started to kind of waffle on things. I think a lot of because of the internal pressure to not do certain things is starting to weigh. You know, it's like, so yeah, there's the outside pressure of what the right wing does to like an Ilhan Omar or other folks that are on our side who are elected. So I'm not taking away from them, but they also are in parties that don't support them either.
Totally. And I mean, it's all a game of power and also money. Like at the end of the day, these folks are worried about their future influence and also their future paychecks on the payroll of the government, right? So, which is owned by, again, the deep-pocketed philanthropists who, once you get to a certain level, they're all Republicans, right? So, like, they just own the whole infrastructure. You're totally right, Kenyon.
I will say I agree with y'all, and I definitely see that because I do think that the difference between the right wing and the left wing is the right wing more so. Even though they are who they are, they stick together. They work together. Nothing divides the Heritage Foundation. Nothing divides the GOP. Nothing divides MAGA. Because if you look at even now, MAGA still supports this man, even though inflation has went up. But on the left side, I'm sorry, but when did being a politician become being a celebrity? Like everybody's vying for their moment in the sun to have that one catchphrase that is, we're not working together. How are we going to fight them if we're not working together?
Well, we are working together here at Power Beyond Pride. This has been an amazing conversation. And we're going to take a short break here because it's been so lively and amazing. And thank you for digging into these conversational topics because they are really relevant for all of us who are doing grassroots and organizing work at every level. Stick with us because we'll be back in a minute to look in the mailbag for your questions right after this little break.
Welcome back to Power Beyond Pride. I'm Kenyon, and I'm here with my co-hosts, Mattie, Shane, and Melodie, and we are queer change makers ourselves. So now it's time to check the mailbag, mailbox, inbox, whatever we're going to call this segment. But, you know, we're gonna get into your question. So let's start there.
Oh, come on. Oh, before we do that, over the break, we had we were having a big discussion internally amongst our hosts and about the concept of the mailbag. Not everyone is in favor of that term mailbag.
So, yeah, gentle listeners, what do we call this thing that we solicit questions from you all from? Is it a mailbag? Is it a mailbox? Is it a drop box? Is it some sort of bunker that you stick letters in that we read? What do you want to call it?
You call it a mail hole?
Call it a mail hole.
No, we cannot.
Yes.
No, because I'm too much with glory hole, and I'm sorry. Everybody's mind is going to go somewhere else. No.
We'll call it the Mattie hole.
Yeah.
The Mattie. The Mattie. We'll call it. No, we'll call it.
Hold on. I got to address that one. It depends on which hole you're talking about, Melodie.
It's up to you. Any hole is a goal.
The message, wow.
Okay,
I don't
so
even know how to
we got a
respond to that.
goal and a 2-point conversion. There we go. You have an actual touchdown and a 2-point conversion, and I'll let your minds wander to that one.
A message center? A message center? Do we call it a message center?
Well, I was going to ask Melly, what is your grievance with the word mailbag? Like, why does it bother you?
Because you say, let's grab messages from the mailbag. A mailbag is a testicle. That's what I see.
I had
Oh,
never
that's what I-
thought about a mailbag as a testicle because you don't do them in plural. Not to, I mean, there are individuals who only have one, but I never think about mailbags. Now I can't. Now I can't stop thinking about them. So thank you, Melody, for that.
Right.
Now I'm
You're
going to double
welcome.
down, if you will, on the mailbag.
You know what? We're calling it the mailbag.
Okay.
That's fine.
Well, I got to say this real quick to Melody. It's so funny that you say that because while we were at Pride in Greensboro this past weekend, Shane laughed at me because the one lady asked, what was the podcast about? And I said, well, we talk about everything from religion to sex. And the lady was like, oh my God. And Shane was like, oh. But since we're talking about testicles and holes and 2-point conversions, I guess we filled our quota for sex tonight. So,
Oh, I
Thank
mean,
you, thank you.
may we never. Proudly queer, proudly living in our own bodies. So I love your idea, Melody. I think we should ask listeners. So for those of you out there listening, we encourage you to share with us, what would you call the section of our podcast where we invite you to share your questions and put them in our slot,
if you start singing mailbag or whatever, I'm not dealing with you tonight.
our mail slot, our message slot. I don't know. Look, we're going to leave that up to our listeners to share with us potential options for that, to give us some things to work through. But until then, our first question comes from Taylor. And Taylor, sounded like I said Ann Taylor, but that's not what I actually said. Okay. And
I
then
do
so
like her
Taylor,
voice, though.
Taylor's question is going to play an audio, and it'll be, how do you go about being a queer activist safely in the current political climate of 2025?
It's hard, boo.
Yeah.
It's real hard. So taking this question literally, like, there are tips and tricks out there for doing the thing safely. If you're going out to protests, there are a bunch of new fun activist tips that exist, like on Instagram and on TikTok, that you can find that are like turning off your phone or turning off your location services, leaving your phone at home, bringing some sort of archaic backup device, some sort of beeper situation or some sort of burner phone, right? That doesn't exactly track your location, wearing things like masks or certain types of makeup that interfere with artificial, like, face scanning, that sort of thing. So there's all those kinds of tips and tricks out there. I think if you're an activist online, it's really hard because there's censorship, which we've already talked about, and online censorship is increasingly robust. And there's also the folks who feel empowered and emboldened by the rhetoric of the current administration, which is, if you're fighting for trans or gender liberation, then you're a terrorist, right? And so people are making their own watch lists. They're putting individuals' names on national lists. It's really hard. I say protect your data privacy in whatever ways you can. Use VPNs, virtual private networks, right? Don't use public Wi-Fi. Don't put there's all kinds of tips and tricks around like online and digital safety and in-person safety for when you're like at a protest. So make sure you have a safety plan, especially if you're on the front lines, because shit will hit the fan at some point, and we just got to be ready.
And also, too, I would actually chime into that with the buddy system. Please use the buddy system. If you're going out to protest, either tell someone where you're going so that they know where you are. If we don't hear from you, we know where to start looking, or go with a group of people or your friend. Go together, because I think that's the biggest thing. And also, too, my biggest tip I would say is keep your head on a swivel and always make sure you pay attention to the other people. Because sometimes, like I was telling a friend this today, it's not so much what you say. You got to think of the reaction of the other person that will now spark someone else to react. That could spark another reaction that now will create a whole catastrophe. So I would just say be very conscious of your surroundings and use the buddy system.
Last thing I'll just say is kind of more in the long, like kind of organizing. Be in deep relationship with people, right? So some of what can happen to people in this moment sometimes can be either people not being either somewhat isolated, right, from organizations and where places where people are really gathering to do this work. But also, if you're connected to an organization that's doing organizing work in your community, actually get to know people and get to know people pretty well, because that will also be the thing that helps people. I always say this when I do talks about kind of movements and whatnot. The civil rights movement didn't just happen and didn't happen at that scale just because of the oppression, or just because it was, or even because it was like, we often gets framed as like Black churches kind of took up, which is definitely a part of what happened. But it was because those churches were bases of people who knew each other really well and in fact, had probably known each other for generations in some cases. Families had known each other. And so you can build that kind of movement through those kind of relationships you have. It's much harder to get people to take those kind of risks, especially on math, if with people they just met or just only know through Instagram. And so I think this is a moment where we also have to really think about how we're actually gathering people in real time and real space and building real deep relationship with people that I think is also going to support people's safety.
Yeah, and I'd like to build on that too, because I think you kind of took the words out of my mouth, Kenyon, in terms of I think we want to look at the reality that other communities have had, and our community as well, has faced oppression before. That there is precedent for the ways that people come into community. I also want to add to that, there are many different ways to be an activist. And sometimes it's the courage to stand in public, to go to a demonstration, to be in those spaces. And I think as Melodie and Mattie and talked about safety, all of those things are incredibly powerful and important things to keep in mind. I think, Kenyon, what you're kind of bringing in that's really meaningful as I think about my own journey and I think about the ways that communities have responded to oppression is that not only in those interrelationships, but that some people did it more quietly. There are many different ways to show up as an activist, and you can gauge your own safety. You can, and I think you need to spend some time thinking about that. And it's okay. Like dissent can take enormously vast types of forms, right? It can be quiet dissent. And there are some community members, again, I think about rural communities where non-faith participants, for example, often feel like they're kind of in a space of dissent. Or as we talked about before, the history of the civil rights movement and the history of queer people throughout history has always been quiet dissent. I'm not necessarily saying that it needs to stop there, like that we need to necessarily go into the quieter times or the shadows. It is saying that your safety, you being here, that is a form of dissent. And if you're a queer person and you're engaging and thriving at whatever level it is that you can do, that is a form of a dissent from a system that fundamentally does not want you to succeed. And so I think understanding what your parameters look like, whether that is personal, private forms of dissent, and that could be just reading up on other ways other communities have engaged in that level of response. So whether that is staying up on literature or materials that are outside the sort of common fray right now that is transphobic and increasingly homophobic, and making sure that you are listening and reading writers who are embodying more of that liberation conversation, that is a way to also be a form of an activist, a little quieter mode. So I just want to acknowledge that there are very public ways to be activists. And then there are very private, personal ways that we can continue the work that needs to be done from a liberation standpoint and take action in the ways that we feel like we can do safely, because that really is important. Again, acts of, in many ways, your existence, your perpetual commitment to seeing the value of your own life and identity move forward, that is a form of activism. And I think that in these moments where those messages are not being said very often, I think it's important to acknowledge that as a truth.
Thanks for that question, Taylor. Our next question comes from Aubrey. I want to know how allies can all work together to do queer activism.
That's a good question, honestly. I really think that it doesn't take much to be an ally. I think people overthink things. I think we live in a time where people overly think everything. Because to be an ally doesn't mean, to go back to what you were saying, Shane, everybody has their own form of activism. It's the same thing for allies. Like everybody's out as an ally doesn't look the same as the next person. So I think the biggest thing you can do to help the queer activism or the movement itself as an ally is just showing up and being present. Whether that is you're a parent and you open your child with, you welcome your child with open arms, or you make a safe haven for people to come to your house, Or if you are weak, I met a rabbi this past weekend who is an ally and an activist, and she opens her church or her temple to anybody, no matter what your walk of life is. So I think there's different ways that you can show up and be an ally to feel like you're making a difference.
Yeah, in some ways, just to build on what Mattie shared there, is that you as an ally might have opportunities to get to spaces that the rest of us cannot. And I think it's always recognizing that it is a privilege in some cases to be in those spaces and to be able to navigate, even again in soft power. There is soft power in diplomacy, and to going into those spaces as somebody that other communities are excluded from, and starting to push things forward a little bit about how those tables get built, how those rooms are made, where those invitations lie, and how you can advocate for the vitality of a multiplicity. And that multiplicity can be vague, right? Yeah, I know you have to navigate your own safety, your own security in that space. But as an ally, like, it's looking for places where your power can have a real influence, even in small discussion, even just by the mere presence of it being.
And I think you don't have to be queer in order to do queer activism or queer change making, right? I think queer people of all walks of life tend to be canaries in the coal mine for all kinds of creeping human rights violations, just like sort of people of color and other marginalized folks. So, which essentially means that they'll come for you next, right? And so, by doing what you can, whoever you are, whatever that looks like, is really powerful. And sometimes it's go to see queer art, right? Pay a drag queen, like. That's supporting queer change making for real. Pay that bitch. She worked hard.
Yeah. Like, amen to everything that was said. And I would just also say too that sometimes it's also, I think people think that to be an ally to whatever group that you have to necessarily be in those spaces or in the same necessarily, but it means that to me, whatever work you're doing, that you don't lose sight of the other people that things impact, right? So I'm not an immigrant, right? But I'm like very concerned about the things that are happening, right? Through ICE, for instance, in this current moment. And so it's up to me to make sure that, one, that I use whatever platforms I have to kind of share what resources are you being deployed to provide defense and support to people, but also to call out where the actual violence is happening, right? And also, I think, and even vice versa, I would say people who are maybe doing work around ICE and some of the kind of immigration stuff is, you can be an ally, say, to Black folks or trans folks, and really talk about, actually, this is how the prison system works, through which other people who are actually citizens are actually subjected to these kinds of conditions all the fucking time, right? And these kinds of abuses. And so you also don't even have to necessarily be in the kind of biggest position of power to also leverage a kind of what people call ally, but I think of as solidarity, right? That across our various identities or kind of locations to power, we have a responsibility to ensure that all people are able to live and thrive without violence and deprivation and gratuitous violence in all those ways.
Do you like allies over like the word accomplice? I'm curious. Like, I've heard some people have been using the word accomplice more, which is this idea, I think, of getting into good trouble. If we honor John Lewis, the language
like
are in good trouble. Right? You like allies or?
I was going to say, one, to me, I think allies build community. I think that word helps to foster a community. But I think allies is a better positive term across the board. I would say it like that.
Yeah, I mean, I understand the thinking behind that, kind of making people accomplice, because I do think that what the point of that is to try to get people to think more about accomplice as a more active term, that I actually have to put my body, my resources into direct relationship with people who are at risk, as opposed to just saying I'm an ally or wearing a t-shirt or something that's less risk, right? For me, I get that. I often think that but I do sometimes think that we get too much in the fucking nomenclature of every goddamn thing. And we didn't miss the point of actually building what I think. I like to talk about solidarity, which to me, I don't give a shit whether you use, frankly, ally, accomplice. I'm more interested in what the thing looks like. And what the thing looks like to me is solidarity. And so I talk from those terms. I do think that as we parse things so much, it becomes almost meaningless or we just get into a debate about which of those nomenclatures and not actually about how we actually building solidarity among people who are different, which I think is the goal.
And I do real quick before we move on, I want to echo Kenyon real quick. I do want to make a point and say that being an ally doesn't mean that you are outside of the community. I do want to speak to our community. We can actually stand up for one another. Like, I need for us to start doing that. A gay man can be a trans woman ally. A trans woman can be a lesbian's ally. We can all be each other's allies. And I think a lot of times we forget that I'm gay, so I'm in the LGBT community, so I can't be an ally. Yes, you can. You still can. I just wanted to point that part out.
Yeah, and that's a big second on that, especially in this current moment where there's, as we talked about in the first segment, I think there's a desire to try to sow division amongst the movement and find those divisions and exploit them. And one way to avoid that exploitation is to recognize that we are all allies. Even if we have similar experience, it's not the same thing as everyone's lived and learned experience, and being able to be an ally.
Well, if everyone is done answering this question, we do want to take a moment and say it was so wonderful to get your questions in the mailbag or the mailbox or the mail hole or the mail slot, whatever you choose. And we thank you for being activists across the world with us, across the country, across the world, because I hope that we are being listened to over in Europe and over in different places. Because this is not just pertaining to America. This is a actual issue that we're all globally are dealing with. So if you have questions about activism or your activist experience or how queer change making can impact your community, send it to, Melodie is going to kill me, mailbag@powerbeyondpride.com. Keep in mind, I did not set this email up, Shane, but I'm not going to throw nobody under the bus. Or visit the site at powerbeyondpride.com to submit your questions. And we always look forward to answering your questions.
Yes, and whether it's a hole or a bag or a box, you can send us a video to any of our social media channels. We want to see you, hear you, and be in communication and in community with you. So feel free to send us video at any of those social channels as well.
And sadly, that's all. Go ahead, Melodie.
Don't send us videos of your hole.
It's sad that you have to say that, but that's true though. Yeah, we don't want a visual of your anything, okay?
I'll take a female hole. I'll take a trans hole. I won't take a male hole.
Well,
I'm so scared about how this clicking. I'm so scared about checking messages moving forward now, and what we have invited. And we do celebrate everybody. We just don't need to see everybody. So we are here to celebrate everybody, but that. Yes. So.
All right. So with that being said, that is all the time we have for this episode of Reply All. And I am so great that we had this moment to sit with each other. I am your co-host, Mattie Bynum. I am, like I said, always the loudest person. You can follow me at Mattie Simone 737 on Instagram and Mattie Bynum on Facebook. And I am joined by my wonderful co-hosts.
Yes, and your co-host, Kenyon Farrow, writer, activist, comm strategist extraordinaire. You can follow me on everything just in my name at Kenyon Farrow. And remember to subscribe and get your friends to subscribe to Power Beyond Pride on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts. And check out our website again at powerbeyondpride.com.
And I am your co-host, Shane Lukas, he, him, his, and I'm the owner of A Great Idea, a creative strategist, lifelong harm reductionist, and I will debate the fine merits of pineapple on pizza and whether or not mailboxes, mail slots, or any variations of receiving mail that isn't spam has value.
And I'm your other co-host, Melodie KG. You can follow me on Instagram at Melodie KG or on Substack at substack.melodiekg.com.
Power Beyond Pride is a project from A Great Idea, a queer-owned design and content agency. You can learn more about them at agreatidea.com. And this episode is produced by Shane Lukas. Also, Mattie Bynum is the project developer. Our editor is Jared Redding with support from Ian Wilson.
And we are all part of the Podcast Awesome host team. So please, like I said, continue to listen and join in. And remember to send your questions and comments. Thank you for listening to Power Beyond.
We look forward to career change making with you. See you next time.